Welcome to True Echo, where powerful moments echo louder than words. This is the story of pride, power, and a lesson taught not with anger, but with quiet, unforgettable wisdom. What began as a routine traffic ticket turned into a courtroom showdown between arrogance and experience. But what happened next stunned everyone. The morning sun baked the streets of downtown Toledo, Ohio, casting long, sharp shadows between the courthouse columns. Officer Bryce Callahan stepped out of his cruiser, polished boots clicking confidently against the pavement. He was only 23 but walked like he'd worn the badge for decades. Fresh out of the academy and high on adrenaline, Bryce believed he was the law. Not just a cog in the system, he thought he owned it. Today's task was simple: show up in court, testify about a minor traffic violation, and get out. He'd pulled over a middle-aged man for rolling through a stop sign. Standard stuff, nothing fancy. But Bryce was already imagining compliments from the judge, nods from senior officers, maybe even a quote in the department bulletin. He adjusted his badge to catch the light just right and strutted through the courthouse doors. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter but no less charged. Older attorneys shuffled files, court clerks passed glances, and even the bailiff offered a subtle shake of the head as Bryce entered. None of it registered with him. To Bryce, the eyes on him weren't skeptical, they were admiring. He took his seat at the front with a little too much stiffness, arms folded, legs planted like a statue of authority. Across the aisle, veteran defense attorney Nain Hollowell leaned toward her colleague and murmured, "Fresh meat." Her colleague chuckled. Bryce, oblivious, sat tall and tapped his fingers with thinly veiled impatience. Then the door behind the bench opened and the courtroom shifted. Judge Roosevelt Bannister stepped in with the quiet gravity of a thundercloud. He didn't raise his voice or carry himself like royalty. He didn't need to. The room moved with him. He was tall, broad, silver-templed, and wrapped in decades of unspoken authority. His face was carved with the weight of experience, and his eyes? They were the kind that had seen too much to be easily impressed. "All rise," the bailiff called, and everyone stood. Bryce, just a beat late, followed suit. Bannister took his seat and scanned the docket. "Traffic violation. Contested citation," he said in a voice like low thunder. "Let's proceed." Bryce almost smirked. "This will be over in 5 minutes." He barely listened as the clerk read out the case details. His mind was already skipping ahead, rehearsing lines, imagining his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. He stood when called and swaggered to the stand, delivering his testimony like he was auditioning for a police drama. Clipped phrases, technical jargon, emphasis on his observational skills. "Non-compliant," he said twice. "Safety risk," he added for effect. He could almost feel the imaginary applause. But then Hollowell stood. Mid-50s, calm, surgical. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Her glasses reflected just enough courtroom light to mask what was behind them. "Officer Callahan," she began smoothly, "you stated the driver rolled through the stop sign. From your position, how many feet were you from the intersection?" Bryce blinked. Just a moment. He hadn't measured. Hadn't needed to, he thought. "I was close enough," he shrugged. Murmurs floated through the courtroom like smoke. Judge Bannister raised an eyebrow. Just a twitch. "Close enough," Hollowell echoed, her voice like silk on steel. "Would you say 20 feet? 50? 100? Maybe 30? Bryce guessed, shifting uncomfortably. "Thank you, officer." She turned but paused. "Your Honor, I may have further questions pending the witnesses' responses." "Proceed," Bannister said evenly. The air in the room was starting to tighten. Bryce felt it but pushed forward. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he interrupted, "I know what I saw. I don't need a tape measure to prove it." The air froze. Even the court reporter hesitated. The bailiff shifted. Bannister didn't flinch. He just stared. Bryce, still full of fire, kept going. "I'm trained to make snap decisions. I don't second-guess myself. That's how I keep people safe." Nain Hollowell smiled. She sat down. Didn't need to do more. Judge Bannister leaned forward slowly. "Officer Callahan," he said quietly, "a courtroom isn't the field. And here words are evidence. Precision matters." Bryce opened his mouth again, but Bannister raised a hand. "Sit down." Not loud. Not angry. Just final. Bryce hesitated, then obeyed, shoulders stiff, cheeks burning. The judge removed his glasses, wiped them carefully, and the silence drew out like a slow heartbeat. He replaced them, then spoke. "This court expects respect, for the process, for the people, and for the truth." The defense rose. "Your Honor, given the officer's uncertainty and demeanor, I respectfully request dismissal. Bryce's head whipped up. Dismissal? For that? But Bannister silenced him with a look. No further argument. Motion granted. Gavel tap. Case dismissed. The man in the brown jacket exhaled relief. Bryce sat frozen. He hadn't just lost. He'd lost everything he thought gave him power. And Judge Bannister wasn't done. Officer Callahan, he said, eyes locked in, stay after adjournment. It wasn't a suggestion. The gallery emptied fast. Lawyers packed faster than usual. The doors closed. And the real lesson was about to begin. The courtroom, once buzzing with murmurs and soft echoes of footsteps, now stood in a tense, motionless silence. The echo of the gavel still seemed to hang in the air like gunpowder smoke after a misfire. Bryce Callahan sat frozen, his spine stiff, fingers clenched on his knees as the heavy courtroom doors thudded shut behind the last of the audience. Judge Bannister didn't look up immediately. He was finishing something, a note maybe, scrawled onto a yellow legal pad with deliberate, exact strokes. Each line felt like a sentence, not on paper but on Bryce's ego. The rookie's mind raced. He'd never been held after court like this. The academy never trained him for this feeling, this heat in the chest, this tightening in the throat. The courtroom, once a stage for his imagined greatness, now felt cavernous and cold. His polished badge, still gleaming on his chest, felt more like a spotlight than a shield. Finally, Bannister set down his pen with a quiet but decisive click. That simple sound cracked through the silence like a verdict. The judge looked up. His gaze was calm, but it bore the full weight of 1,000 rulings, thousands of eyes, thousands of lives who had stood where Bryce stood now, on the precipice between arrogance and truth. Officer Callahan, he began, not unkind but far from soft, do you know why I asked you to stay behind? Bryce cleared his throat. His voice came out small, too small for the size of his chest. No, Your Honor. Bannister gave a slow nod, as if Bryce had just proven something without even realizing it. You're new, Bannister said. That's obvious. That's not a crime. A flicker of relief crossed Bryce's face. But arrogance, Bannister continued, leaning back slightly, arrogance in this building, in any building where the law is practiced, that is dangerous. Bryce opened his mouth, an instinct, but Bannister held up a hand. The same small gesture that silenced a room full of egos. You think that badge gives you power? Bannister said, voice still level. And it does. In a way. But it also puts a target on your back. It makes you responsible for every single decision you make, especially when nobody's watching. Bryce sat there, suddenly hyper-aware of the sweat gathering beneath his collar. Bannister leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his eyes piercing. Out there, on the streets, maybe you can bluff your way through a stop. Maybe you can bark orders and get compliance. But in here, he gestured subtly to the courtroom, this is a different battlefield. And we play by different rules. Bryce said nothing. Not because he agreed, yet, but because something in him was beginning to crack. The certainty, the polish, the swagger, it was eroding. In here, Bannister said, quieter now, it's about truth, about facts, about humility. He let the last word hang in the air. Not heavy, not angry, just real. You treated this courtroom today like it was your turf, like your pride mattered more than the law. That may fly with some judges. It won't fly with me. Worse, you disrespected the oath you swore to uphold. Bryce looked down. He didn't have a comeback for that. Not today. You think you're tough because you wear a uniform? Bannister's tone sharpened just a little. You want to know what real toughness looks like? He tapped his chest with a thick, calloused finger. Real toughness is knowing when to shut up, when to listen, when to admit you're wrong. Bryce blinked, eyes on the floor, hands fidgeting slightly on the hem of his belt. You got lucky today, Bannister said, his voice quieter, sterner. If I wanted, I could file a complaint for your conduct in this courtroom. I could have your department hear about this before you even reach the parking lot. Bryce's heart dropped. No, please, Your Honor, he stammered, almost whispered. Bannister let the fear simmer for a second, just enough. I'm not going to, he finally said. Not because you deserve leniency, but because you're young. And maybe, you'll remember this moment when it matters most. Bryce looked up for the first time with no shield. No pride. Just eyes. Young. Stung. And quietly searching. Bannister's voice dropped to almost a whisper. You are not the badge, he said. You are the decisions you make while wearing it. The words hit harder than any insult could. Because they weren't insults. They were truths. Bryce nodded slowly. No rebuttal. No protest. No swagger. Just acknowledgement. "You're dismissed," Bannister said, turning back to his desk. Bryce stood, awkwardly, like a kid who didn't know how to walk in his dad's shoes. He gave a nod, not the kind they teach in the academy. A different one. One born of something deeper. Respect. He left the courtroom silently, the door shutting softly behind him. Outside the sun had shifted. The heat hadn't changed, but it felt different now. Realer. Less cinematic. More grounded. He paused at the steps, looking out across the plaza. Something had shifted inside. He couldn't name it yet, but it was there. Something broken, but not in a bad way. Like a joint that had been popped back into place. And behind him, somewhere in the deep silence of the courtroom, a veteran judge returned to his paperwork, hoping that for once, his words would echo longer than a lecture. The station locker room always smelled faintly of sweat, leather, and that weird metallic scent of cold gear after a long shift. Bryce had been in there countless times before, changing, talking trash, checking his phone. But that afternoon, returning from the courthouse, it felt like a different world. He moved slower. Each step echoed louder than he remembered, as if the concrete floor was trying to remind him he wasn't walking the same way he had that morning. He dropped onto the wooden bench in front of his locker, staring at the closed metal door for a long second before even reaching for the combination lock. Around him, the usual buzz was missing. It was quiet. The few other officers in the room gave him polite nods but said nothing. Word spread fast in places like this. You didn't need a memo when raised eyebrows and tight-lipped glances did the job. Bryce sat in silence. His badge gleamed faintly in the fluorescent light, and he stared at it, suddenly unsure of what it meant anymore. Earlier that morning he'd believed it was armor. A crown. Something that automatically demanded respect. But now it looked more like a test, one he hadn't realized he was failing. He turned as the door opened and Officer Mark Whitaker stepped in. Whit was a 10-year vet, easygoing but sharp when it counted. He had the kind of authority Bryce had always wanted, unspoken, calm, and earned. Whit nodded. Court wrap up early? Bryce hesitated. Yeah, something like that. Whit raised an eyebrow but didn't push. He walked over to his own locker, popped it open, and started pulling off his vest. How'd it go? Bryce leaned forward, elbows on knees. I got called out. Hard. Whit stopped mid-motion. Judge Bannister? Bryce nodded. Whit let out a low whistle and sat down across from him. Man doesn't waste his words. Bryce laughed under his breath. Not a funny laugh, more like air escaping. I thought I had it locked. Slam dunk. Open and shut. But he just dismantled me. Word by word. Whit leaned back against the lockers. Bannister's not out to humiliate anyone. If he took the time to say something, it meant he saw something in you that wasn't a lost cause. Bryce looked up, confused. That's not what it felt like. Because you're not used to being challenged where your badge doesn't protect you, Whit said. The streets give you authority. A courtroom strips it down to evidence and judgment. Two things you can't swagger your way through. Bryce winced. I thought I was helping. I thought being sure of myself was part of the job. Whit smiled. Confidence is fine. But the job will teach you this, Bryce. Being sure and being right are not the same thing. And being loud doesn't make you correct. It just makes you louder. The room went quiet again. Bryce finally turned and opened his locker. Inside, photos were taped up from the academy. He looked so different in them. Fresh. Invincible. He pulled out a worn notebook, the one they all got in week 1 of the academy. On the inside cover was a quote their instructor had written in black sharpie. You carry more than a weapon. You carry someone's tomorrow. He hadn't thought about that line in weeks, maybe months, but now it hit harder than ever. Whit, Bryce said, voice softer, how do you come back from messing up like that? Whit looked at him a long moment, then shrugged. You don't. Not the same anyway. But that's a good thing. You don't want to be the same. You want to be better. Bryce let the silence sit for a second. Then he nodded slowly. I think I needed it. Whit grinned. We all did. Some of us got it in the field. Some of us in a hospital room. You got it from Bannister. That's a better deal than most. Just then, the sergeant's voice crackled over the intercom. All units report to roll call. Shift briefing in 5. Whit stood. Come on, rookie. Let's get back to work. Bryce stood too. Something about the word rookie didn't sting this time. Just felt true. And for once, he didn't resent it. He was still learning. Still earning. He clipped his radio back on, adjusted his vest, not to look sharp but to be ready. To serve. Maybe not perfectly. But honestly. As they walked out of the locker room, he looked over at Whit. Hey, you ever been chewed out by a judge before? Whit chuckled. Kid, I once called a federal judge, dude, by accident. Took me a year to live that down. Bryce laughed, a real one this time. And with that, the door swung open, the hallway buzzed with voices, and the job resumed. But Bryce wasn't the same man walking out of that locker room. And that made all the difference. Later that week, Bryce found himself driving through a quiet neighborhood just past dusk, the blue and red glow of his cruiser's computer screen faintly lighting the interior. He wasn't rushing to a call. No sirens. No adrenaline. Just patrol. But his thoughts were anything but calm. The city looked different now. Not because the buildings had changed, but because he had. Every stop sign, every set of headlights, every pair of eyes watching him pass held more weight than before. The uniform still fit, but the meaning behind it felt heavier, more complex. The radio crackled. Unit 27, you have a civilian ride-along scheduled for pickup. Bryce blinked. Right. He'd forgotten. He pulled up to the station's front, where a lanky teen with oversized glasses and a clipboard stood waiting, bouncing slightly on his heels. James Rodriguez? Bryce asked, stepping out. The kid nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. Thanks for letting me come along. I'm writing a paper for school, community policing and modern challenges. I want to be a cop one day too. Bryce gave a polite nod, but something in his stomach twisted. I wanted to be a cop one day too, he thought. Still do. Just trying to figure out what that means now. They got into the car and pulled away from the curb. James adjusted his seatbelt like he was on a ride at Disneyland. So, what's it like? Really like, being out here every day? Bryce paused. Depends on the day, he said finally. Some days are boring. Some days are tough. James scribbled something into his notebook. They rode in silence for a minute before Bryce asked, You think you've got what it takes to wear a badge? James sat up straighter. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not good at running or anything. But I believe in justice. I believe in helping people. Bryce glanced over at the kid, maybe 16, maybe 17. Big ideas. Bright eyes. No scars yet. You ever think about what happens when you're wrong? He asked softly. James hesitated. You mean, if I make a bad call? Bryce nodded. Or if someone gets hurt because you missed something. Or worse, because you thought you knew something you didn't. James looked out the window. I guess. I haven't thought that far ahead yet. Bryce sighed. I hadn't either. They kept driving. A few minutes later, dispatch radioed in a 10 to 16 domestic disturbance. Nothing urgent. Just voices raised. Neighbor called it in. Bryce flipped the cruiser around. James tensed. Are we going in? Bryce glanced at him. We're checking it out. Stay in the car. Always. They pulled up to a small brick duplex. Lights on in the living room. A woman's voice echoed faintly through the thin walls. Then silence. Bryce stepped out slowly, adjusting his radio. James watched from the front seat, eyes wide behind the glass. Bryce knocked on the door. A man answered, middle-aged, wiry, shirtless, breathing heavy. A deep red line traced across his cheek. Behind him, a woman clutched a phone and looked exhausted. We're fine, the man said gruffly. Bryce didn't flinch. Just here to make sure. Mind if I speak with her alone for a minute? The man hesitated, then stepped back. Inside, Bryce kept his voice low. Come. Measured. The woman, Elise, wasn't injured, just tired. It wasn't the first argument. Maybe not even the worst. But tonight, she said, something felt different. He didn't push. Just listened. Just saw her. And for once, that felt more important than filing a report. You want to come down and talk to someone? He asked. She shook her head. Not tonight. He nodded. Okay. But here's my card. And here's the number for the shelter. It's not about weakness. It's about knowing when it's time to take care of yourself. She looked at him a long moment, then took the card. Back in the cruiser, James looked up anxiously. Are they okay? For now, Bryce said, sliding into the seat. But that can change. Fast. James opened his mouth to say something, but Bryce added, You can't fix people with a citation. Sometimes all you can do is make sure they know someone sees them. James nodded slowly, as if filing the thought away somewhere deep. They finished the shift in relative quiet. On the drive back to the station, James turned to him and asked, Have you always been like this? Like so patient? So calm? Bryce nearly laughed. No. Not even close. The ride-along ended with a handshake. Thanks again, Officer Callahan. I think this helped more than any textbook could. Bryce watched him go, thinking of all the rookies who'd come after. Bright-eyed. Big dreams. Not a clue how heavy the badge really was. But maybe this one would remember tonight. And maybe, just maybe, he'd carry it a little differently. A week passed. Bryce kept his head down, did the work, stayed off the radar. No more swagger. No more badge-tapping dramatics. Just calls, paperwork, patrol. Quiet shifts blurred into one another, the edges of each day softened by exhaustion and quiet reflection. But peace doesn't last long in uniform. It was a rainy Tuesday when the sergeant called him into the office. Sergeant Maddox was a broad-shouldered woman with sharp eyes and a voice that rarely rose above low authority, because it never had to. Bryce entered the office, wet from the downpour, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat. "Sit," she said, nodding to the chair in front of her desk. She slid a manila folder across the desk toward him. He opened it, and his stomach dropped. Inside was a typed letter, attached to a department incident review form. The complainant? Judge Roosevelt Bannister. Bryce's mouth went dry. "Before you say anything," Maddox said, steepling her fingers, "read the whole thing." He obeyed. It wasn't a formal complaint in the disciplinary sense. Bannister hadn't recommended sanctions. Hadn't demanded an internal investigation. It wasn't a punishment. It was a letter. But it might as well have been a scalpel. To whom it may concern. Date. Officer Bryce Callahan appeared in my courtroom to provide testimony on a contested citation. During this session, I observed behavior that, while not unlawful, indicated a concerning level of immaturity, overconfidence, and a misunderstanding of courtroom protocol. Officer Callahan demonstrated a lack of respect for the gravity of the legal process, speaking out of turn, posturing with his badge, and undermining the very system he swore to support. However, let me be clear. I am not submitting this in pursuit of reprimand. I am submitting it in hope of correction. I believe Officer Callahan has potential. Raw, undeveloped, perhaps misdirected, but real. I've seen worse men turn better with the right reflection. I request that Officer Callahan be scheduled for departmental mentorship or retraining regarding courtroom conduct and professional humility. Not to punish but to prepare. Because I believe he can be more. He just doesn't know how yet. Respectfully, Judge Roosevelt Bannister. Bryce finished reading and sat back in silence. The shame he'd been dragging behind him for the last week now fused with something else, an ache he couldn't name. Not humiliation. Not exactly. Something closer to being seen. And still given a chance. Sergeant Maddox didn't say anything for a long time. Just watched him. Then she spoke. "Bannister's the last person I'd ever want filing something like this against me. But also, the only judge I'd trust to tell the truth without venom." Bryce nodded once. "I messed up." "Yeah, you did," she said, no judgment in her tone. "But here's the thing, Callahan, this letter? It's not a nail in your coffin. It's a blueprint. You build something from it or it buries you. Your choice." Bryce looked up, steadier now. "I want to build." Maddox leaned back and tapped the file. "Then we start here." She handed him another form, this one from the Field Training Officer Program. Mentorship. Workshops. Sit-ins on courtroom sessions with a liaison. You're gonna spend some time learning from guys who've been to hell and back. Listening. Watching. No interruptions. No shortcuts. And no badges to hide behind. Bryce felt something stir deep in his chest. Not excitement. Not fear. Something in between. Understood. "Dismissed," Maddox said, already reaching for her next file. As he stepped out into the hallway, the station bustled around him. Phones ringing, radios crackling, boots squeaking on tile. But inside Bryce felt still. Like something had just shifted into place. He was being given a second chance. And this time he wouldn't waste it. Later that night, Bryce sat alone at his kitchen table. His apartment was small, too small for the dreams he used to carry. He pulled out the notebook again. The one from the academy. He flipped to a blank page. At the top he wrote in thick black letters. Not the badge. The decisions. And beneath it he started a list, not of achievements, not of arrests or citations, but of lessons. Things no academy ever taught. 1. Respect is earned in silence more than in sound. 2. Power without humility becomes a threat. 3. The courtroom is not a place to win, it's a place to serve the truth. 4. Being right doesn't mean being righteous. 5. The badge is not who I am. It's who I choose to be while wearing it. He sat back. For the first time in weeks, his chest didn't feel hollow. He wasn't perfect, but he was becoming. 3 weeks into the retraining program, Bryce was different. Not fixed, he wasn't that naive, but aware. He listened more. He wrote things down. He showed up early and left last. His uniform looked the same, but something in his posture had changed. More grounded, less performative. The mentorship sessions were grueling in the best way. Ride-alongs with veterans. Observation hours in courtrooms. Shadowing officers in departments that didn't just police but served. And Judge Bannister? He'd seen him twice since. The first time, Bryce sat silently in the back row of the courtroom, dressed in plain clothes. Bannister didn't even acknowledge him until the end of the day, when he passed by and gave him a single nod. The second time, the judge called a break in proceedings, walked to where Bryce sat and said only, "Keep showing up." That was it. And somehow it meant everything. But transformation has a funny way of inviting one final test. A way to check if the lesson stuck. For Bryce, it came on a Thursday afternoon. He and his mentor, Officer Raymond Shields, a grizzled man with hands like brick and a voice like gravel, had been out on a community meet and greet patrol. It was slow. Handshakes. Ice cream shop hellos. Nothing heavy. Until dispatch cracked in. Units nearby respond to 10 to 50. Minor two-car collision. No injuries reported. Location, Eastland and Thatcher. Close by, Shields said, flicking the turn signal. Let's roll. The scene was simple enough. 2 sedans bumped at the intersection. One silver, one navy. The navy driver was an older black man in a charcoal blazer, standing calmly by the hood of his car. The silver car's driver, a young white woman in business attire, was pacing with her phone, clearly agitated. Bryce approached the woman while Shields went to the older man. "I was right there," the woman said sharply, her voice rising with each word. "And he just rolled out like I wasn't even coming." "Okay, ma'am," Bryce said gently. "Let's walk through it slowly. Were you stopped or moving when?" "You need to arrest him," she barked suddenly. "He cursed at me. And I think he was trying to intimidate me." Bryce blinked. "Arrest?" "Yes," she snapped. "I told him I'd call the police and he laughed at me. That's harassment." Bryce glanced at the man standing quietly beside his car, arms crossed. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't moving aggressively. He looked tired. "Let me get both sides," Bryce said, stepping back before she could say more. He walked over to Shields, who gave a subtle shake of his head. "She claims he swerved into her," Shields muttered. "He claims she was speeding and ran the light. No cameras on this stretch. No damage beyond surface scrapes." Bryce nodded. "He angry?" he asked. "No," Shields said. "Calm. Polite. Said he's used to this kind of thing." Bryce felt something dark stir in his chest. They finished taking statements, photographs, and exchanged info. There was nothing to arrest anyone for. No injuries. No cause for escalation. Bryce returned to the woman. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this appears to be a civil matter. No one's hurt and there's not enough evidence to determine fault here. We've got your statements. Insurance will handle the rest." She stared at him, furious. "You're not going to arrest him?" "No, ma'am," Bryce replied. She stepped closer. "You have to do something. I'm the victim here." Bryce didn't flinch. "I understand you're upset. But nothing happened here that meets the threshold for arrest." Her face twisted in disbelief. "Do you know who my father is?" Bryce stood still. "No, ma'am. And that wouldn't change the facts." She let out a sharp laugh. "Unbelievable. This is reverse discrimination. I'm going to file a complaint. You'll be sorry." Bryce's heart pounded, not from fear but from familiarity. This was the test. Not a badge test. A character test. The kind you don't study for. The kind you live. He kept his voice calm. "You're free to file a complaint if you believe it's appropriate. My badge number is 2874. He didn't look away. The woman scoffed, stormed to her car, and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Shields watched her drive off and gave a slow whistle. "You handled that better than I expected." Bryce exhaled. "Didn't even raise my voice." "Nope," Shields said. "Didn't have to. That's the real thing, Callahan. That's what we've been trying to teach you." They walked back to the cruiser in silence. Bryce looked over his shoulder once at the older man, who gave a subtle nod. A nod Bryce now recognized. One of mutual understanding. Quiet thanks. A gesture beyond words. Back in the car, Shields didn't speak for a while. Then, "You ever think about what kind of officer you want to be in 5 years?" Bryce stared out the window. The rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered. "Yeah," he said eventually. "I want to be the kind that gets remembered, for the right reasons. Shields nodded. You're getting there, kid. Slow but solid. And as they drove off, Bryce felt something settle deep in his chest. He'd passed the test. Not with a gun. Not with force. With restraint. With clarity. With growth. And somewhere deep in the walls of a quiet courthouse, Judge Bannister would have smiled if he'd seen it. The following Monday, a call came into the department that wasn't urgent but still got passed directly to Bryce. It came from Judge Bannister's clerk. He's requesting Officer Callahan's presence, she said, voice crisp but not unfriendly. Not for testimony. Not for court. He asked if you could stop by Chambers. This afternoon, if possible. Bryce stared at the receiver like it might explain itself. Just stop by? Yes. Privately. The last time Bryce had been asked to stay after court, it hadn't gone so well. But this didn't feel like punishment. It didn't feel like discipline. It felt intentional. He agreed and cleared his schedule. At 3:12 p.m., Bryce walked up the narrow hall behind Courtroom 3 and was buzzed in by the clerk. Bannister's chambers weren't flashy. A few shelves. A couple framed photos. One of a young Bannister in uniform, military by the looks of it. Another with him shaking hands with a civil rights icon. A third, a folded flag in a case hung with reverence near the back wall. The judge sat behind his desk, reading glasses on the tip of his nose, scribbling into a leather notebook. He looked up when Bryce stepped in. Have a seat, officer. Bryce obeyed, his posture respectful but no longer rigid with fear. Just open. Bannister finished writing, closed the notebook and folded his hands. I heard about the Eastland incident, he said calmly. Bryce felt his chest tighten. News travels. It does. Especially when a witness in the grocery store parking lot wrote me a letter. Bannister reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded paper. Apparently she was surprised. Said the officer handled the situation with uncommon grace. Said she saw something she hadn't expected, patience. Bryce blinked. He hadn't even noticed anyone watching. Bannister continued. And the older gentleman involved? He came by the courthouse 2 days later. Didn't file a complaint. Didn't demand anything. Just wanted to say thank you, to an officer who didn't assume, didn't escalate and didn't walk away. Bryce didn't know what to say. You remember what I told you? Bannister asked. About not being the badge, but the decisions? Yes, sir. Bannister leaned forward, eyes locking in. You're starting to live that. Not perform it. Live it. That matters. Bryce swallowed, his voice low. I've made a lot of mistakes. You're supposed to, Bannister said without blinking. The difference is in whether you learn. That courtroom incident? You were on a path. One I've seen destroy men, good men even. You got off it. That's rare. He opened a drawer, pulled out an envelope and slid it across the desk. Bryce picked it up slowly. Inside was a printed copy of Bannister's letter to the department, the one he'd read weeks ago. Except now there was a handwritten note at the bottom. Update. Officer Callahan has demonstrated measurable growth. I retract any recommendation for retraining. I instead recommend him for peer mentoring and community outreach programs. There is value in experience, but also in those who've survived humility and come out stronger. Signed, Roosevelt Bannister. Bryce stared at it, throat tight. I don't hand those out like candy, Bannister said quietly. But some lessons stick deeper than others. And I think you've earned this. I don't know what to say, Bryce murmured. Then don't say anything, Bannister replied, standing. Just keep earning it. Day by day. Call by call. Word by word. Bryce stood, straightened his shoulders, not out of pride but out of intent. As he reached for the door, Bannister added, Oh, one more thing. Bryce turned back. I've been invited to speak at the youth outreach event next month. Kids from the city. Some from juvie. Some just trying not to get there. They asked me to bring someone from law enforcement. Someone they'll listen to. Someone who's made mistakes, and came back better. Bryce blinked. You want me to come with you? Bannister smiled. I want you to speak. Bryce froze. He wasn't ready. But maybe that's why it mattered. Okay, he said. I'll do it. Bannister nodded. Good. Because stories like yours don't belong in silence. They belong in the hands of people who need to believe they can change too. As Bryce walked out of those chambers, sunlight poured through the hallway windows. He wasn't the same man who had once strutted through the courtroom doors, badge first and mind closed. He was still flawed, still learning. But now he had something real to say. The community center gym was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled the hardwood floor, echoing with the restless energy of teenagers who didn't want to be there but had nowhere else to go. Some leaned back with crossed arms and skeptical eyes. Others whispered, snickered, stared at their phones. It was the kind of crowd that could eat you alive if you weren't real. Bryce stood just off stage, peeking through the curtain at the audience. His palms were sweating. His heart beat loud. Behind him, Judge Bannister stood calm, arms crossed, nodding slowly. "You sure about this?" Bryce asked, voice low. Bannister didn't look at him. "You've already lived the story. All you have to do now is tell it." "I'm not good with speeches." "You don't need to give a speech. You need to tell the truth." The MC, a local community leader named Jamal Price, stepped to the mic. "Next up, we've got someone who probably doesn't look like who you thought you'd hear from today. But he's got a story, and if you give him 5 minutes he just might give you something to carry with you a lot longer. Officer Bryce Callahan." The room clapped, softly, politely, maybe even a bit sarcastically. Bryce stepped into the spotlight. The mic felt too close. The crowd looked too large. Every teenager's face seemed carved from stone. He cleared his throat. "I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I have it all figured out," he started. "I'm not going to give you some lecture about rules and consequences in the system, because I know most of you already live inside systems you didn't create." A few heads turned. The whispering paused. "What I will tell you," he continued, "is that a few months ago I thought I knew everything. I thought wearing a badge meant people had to listen to me. That being loud made me right. That confidence was the same thing as power." He looked down for a second, then back up. "Then I stood in a courtroom and got torn apart. Not by a lawyer. Not even by a defense. But by a judge, one who saw through my badge and my ego and looked right at me." He gestured toward the back where Judge Bannister stood, arms still crossed. "And instead of humiliating me or punishing me, he gave me the one thing I didn't even know I needed." He paused. "A second chance." Now the room was still. Not quiet because of politeness, quiet because they were listening. Bryce continued, more sure now. "See, the badge doesn't make you strong. The uniform doesn't make you respected. You can wear every symbol of authority and still be empty inside." Heads nodded. A few arms uncrossed. "I used to think strength was about controlling the room," he said. "Now I know, it's about controlling yourself." He took a breath. "Some of you already carry more pressure than I ever will. You've had to grow up faster, be tougher, fight harder. And I won't stand up here and pretend I understand all of it. But I will tell you this." He looked out at them, really looked. "You are not your mistakes. You are what you do after them." For a moment, it was as if the whole gym held its breath. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then more. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. As he stepped off stage, Bannister was waiting, one eyebrow raised. "Not bad," the judge said. "You didn't even faint." Bryce let out a nervous laugh. "I thought about it," he said. Jamal Price approached, hand extended. "We could use more talks like that. Real ones. Ever think about doing this more often?" Bryce hesitated. "I'm still learning." "That's the best time to teach," Jamal said. "Before you forget what it felt like." Later that night, Bryce sat on the steps outside the community center, the crowd long gone, the street quiet again. He pulled out his notebook. The same one from the academy. The one he'd nearly tossed away that night after Bannister's first courtroom takedown. He flipped to his list. Added one more line. 6. Strength isn't silence or shouting. It's standing in front of people and showing them the cracks. He closed the notebook. He'd said what he needed to say. But life had a way of testing you again just when you thought the lesson was over. Because the next morning, he got a call. From Internal Affairs. And this time it wasn't about his past. It was about something happening right now. The next morning dawned over Toledo with a gray uncertainty that mirrored Bryce's inner turmoil. He sat at his kitchen table with a hastily brewed cup of coffee when the phone rang, a shrill sound that cut through the quiet of his cramped apartment. Bryce's heart sank as he answered, bracing himself for bad news. "Officer Callahan, this is Lieutenant Harris from Internal Affairs," the voice said, formal yet devoid of anger. "We need you to come in immediately. There's been a complaint filed regarding yesterday's handling of a domestic incident. You're required to provide a full statement." The words hit Bryce like a physical blow. Just last night, he had stood in front of an audience and spoken his truth. His heartfelt speech had been celebrated, or so he thought. Now he was being accused of something he hadn't even considered. His gut churned with anxiety and dread. He ran a hand through his hair and muted his simmering thoughts with a deep, shaky breath. "Understood, Lieutenant. I'll be there as soon as possible, Bryce managed, his voice tight and measured. For the drive to the station, his mind replayed the events of the previous week. The courtroom, the locker room, the ride along, the domestic incident he'd resolved with calm diligence. And now this new complaint loomed over him like a storm cloud. He clutched the steering wheel hard, every mile intensifying the internal conflict between the progress he'd made and the fear of being undermined by one misstep. At the Internal Affairs Office, a sterile environment devoid of the familiarity of his precinct, Bryce was led into a stark interrogation room. The white walls and harsh fluorescent lights did little to ease his mounting anxiety. Lieutenant Harris sat across from him, a file folder open in front of him, filled with reports and witness statements from the incident Bryce had handled. "Officer Callahan," Lieutenant Harris began after a pause, "we've received several reports regarding your conduct yesterday. Witnesses claim that your decision not to detain the complainant under disputed circumstances might have endangered public trust. There are also concerns about your demeanor during the call, specifically, an alleged remark you made that might be construed as dismissive." Bryce's mind raced. He remembered the moment clearly. The woman, enraged at not having her demands met, had threatened to file a complaint. In response, his voice had remained calm, firm, and measured. But perhaps the witnesses had misinterpreted his tone, misunderstood his commitment to de-escalation as indifference. "I followed protocol," Bryce began slowly, carefully choosing each word. "I confirmed that there was no imminent threat and noted that no injuries were present. I explained that a civil matter needed resolution through the proper channels. My priority was to de-escalate the situation, not to inflame it further." Lieutenant Harris's expression remained impassive as he scanned Bryce's statement. "Protocol isn't just about following steps, officer. It's about ensuring that every interaction reinforces the community's trust in law enforcement. Some reports suggest that you might have been dismissive. Can you explain your tone during your interaction with the complainant?" Bryce's heart pounded as he tried to recall every nuance. "I admit," he said with measured restraint, "that I may have been direct, perhaps too direct. However, I believe directness is sometimes necessary to keep a situation from escalating further. But if my tone was perceived as dismissive, I regret that perception. My intention was always to calm the situation." The lieutenant's eyes flickered, recording his words silently as Bryce continued. "I stand by the decisions I made. I also believe that every officer's actions should be looked at in the broader context of growth. I've been undergoing retraining and mentorship to ensure that I approach each situation with the right balance of authority, empathy, and respect. Yesterday's incident was a test, one where I measured my growth against my past errors." He paused, swallowing down the turbulence inside him. "I understand that mistakes can be viewed harshly, but I trust the review of all the facts will show that my choices were guided by a commitment to de-escalation and fairness." Lieutenant Harris tapped his pen against the file and leaned back. "Your record up until now has been mixed. There have been moments of commendable restraint as well as instances that raised concerns. This isn't just about one incident, it's about the pattern of behavior we're beginning to see. You've been on a path of change, officer, and that's commendable, but you must understand that every decision is scrutinized." He glanced at Bryce with a measured look. "Do you have anything more to add? Anything that might clarify your actions further?" Bryce took a steadying breath, remembering the lessons etched into his notebook. "Not the badge, the decisions." His voice grew resolute. "I believe the truth lies in understanding that growth is continuous. I have accepted my previous errors and I have committed myself to learning from them. I also believe that my handling of the incident, though perhaps seen as rigid by some, was conducted with the best interest of all parties in mind. I have nothing to hide, and I'm prepared to undergo any additional training if necessary. I only ask that my efforts to improve be seen for what they are, a genuine commitment to serve and protect with dignity." Lieutenant Harris's silence stretched on for what seemed an eternity. The room felt smaller, the stakes heavier than ever before. Finally, he closed the folder with a measured snap. "Officer Callahan, we will review your statement along with the witness reports and video footage, if available. For now, consider this a formal notice that your actions are under review. You are placed on temporary administrative duty pending the outcome." His tone softened just a fraction. "I hope you understand, this isn't the end but a checkpoint. Your performance moving forward will be critical." Bryce nodded, though the weight of the lieutenant's words pressed on him like an anchor. "Understood, sir." Exiting the building, Bryce felt the chill of the early morning air, a harsh contrast to the turbulent warmth inside his chest. Every step he took on the pavement echoed the uncertainty of his future. a future that now teetered on the edge of either redemption or downfall. He made his way back to his cruiser in a daze. The events of the past few weeks, the courtroom lesson, the ride-along with insights of humility, the heartfelt speech at the community center, and now this administrative review, wove together into a tapestry that was both inspiring and perilous. As Bryce drove through the familiar streets of Toledo, every red light, every pedestrian crossing, felt charged with meaning. Was he the man he aspired to be? Was this trial by fire the crucible that would reform him for the better, or was it a sign that his early arrogance still lurked beneath the surface, waiting to resurge? He recalled Judge Bannister's words, "You are not the badge, you are the decisions you make wearing it." Each decision was a brushstroke on the canvas of his character, painting a picture of honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to change. Now, as he faced the possibility of losing it all, Bryce understood that his journey was far from over. The review, though intimidating, was a test, a final question to answer about who he was becoming. That night, Bryce returned home with little sleep. In the dim glow of his living room, he opened his notebook again. The old pages, once filled with cadenced lessons, now seemed to demand new insights born of this latest trial. He scribbled furiously, pouring out his anxieties and hopes in equal measure. Every mistake is a step forward if I learn from it. Trust is earned one decision at a time. Tonight, I am not defined by what others say, but by what I choose to do moving forward. In that quiet moment, Bryce understood that the true reckoning wasn't in the formal complaint or the scrutiny of his superiors, it was in the internal dialogue that would drive him to be better. With every pen stroke, he reaffirmed his commitment to serve with honor, to balance authority with humility. He closed his notebook and leaned back, facing the uncertainty of tomorrow with a resolve that was tempered by both fear and hope. The coming days would decide whether he was ready to truly embody the lessons of his past or if he would be consumed by his old self, arrogant and out of touch with the true essence of duty. 3 days passed. 3 long, quiet days on administrative duty, no uniform, no street patrol, just filing reports in a back office, far from the rhythm of real police work. Bryce felt like a ghost in his own precinct. Some officers nodded when they passed him in the hall. Others didn't. Whispers followed him like shadows. But the real storm wasn't out there. It was inside. He'd done everything right, or at least better. He'd listened, learned, de-escalated, chosen restraint over dominance. And still, the system had summoned him back to the edge, threatening to undo all his progress with a single accusation. On Friday morning his phone rang. It was Sergeant Maddox. "Report to Conference Room B. Internal Affairs Review has concluded." The words dropped like bricks in his stomach. When he arrived, the room was already filled. Lieutenant Harris, Captain Brenner, a department counselor, and, surprisingly, Judge Roosevelt Bannister, seated near the end of the table, not in robes, but in a charcoal blazer and open-collared shirt. Bryce stood straight, no longer hiding behind pride, but bracing for whatever came next. Harris opened a folder. "We've reviewed the body cam footage, the witness statements, and your own report. We've cross-checked your previous conduct logs and training progression over the last 2 months." Pause. "Based on the evidence," he continued, "there is no finding of misconduct in the Eastland incident." Bryce didn't exhale, not yet. "In fact," Harris added, "the footage supports your account entirely. Your tone was firm but professional. You attempted de-escalation. You offered clear guidance to both parties without bias or emotional reaction." He closed the folder and looked Bryce in the eye. "You handled the situation well. And under pressure." The knot in Bryce's chest finally loosened. Captain Brenner leaned forward. "But this goes beyond just clearing your name. We've been watching you, Callahan. Not to trap you, but to see what you'd do with the second chance Judge Bannister insisted you deserved." She tapped a separate file. "This department is starting a new initiative, peer outreach and integrity leadership. It's a mouthful, yeah, but it means we're choosing a handful of officers who've been through the fire and come out better. Officers who can mentor the next wave. Help them learn what the academy doesn't teach." Bryce blinked. "You're offering that to me?" "We are," she said. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're not." The room went quiet for a beat. Then Bannister spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "There are moments in a man's life that define him, Callahan. But more often, it's what he does after those moments that tell the truth. You failed, yes. But you didn't run from it. You stood still. Faced it. Grew." He folded his hands on the table. "I fought to give you a second chance. And today I'm proud to see you earned it." Bryce swallowed hard. "I'm honored, sir." "No," Bannister replied. You're responsible. The honor comes later, when you pass it forward. After the meeting, as Bryce walked out of the conference room, everything felt brighter, not because the weight was gone, but because he was finally strong enough to carry it. Out in the parking lot, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against a bench. James Rodriguez, the high school kid from the ride-along. Officer Callahan, he said, jumping up. I saw your name on the community board, thought I'd come by. I'm doing my final paper on police reform through personal growth. Thought you might still be the right guy to interview. Bryce smiled. I think I've got a few things to say now. They sat on the bench, sun warming their backs. As James scribbled questions in his notebook, Bryce began talking. Not like a hero but like a man who had been humbled, challenged, and rebuilt. He told him about the stop sign, the courtroom, Bannister's rebuke, the ride-along, the outreach speech, the complaint, and the decision that mattered most. To me, Bryce said, the badge isn't a shield. It's a mirror. It shows you who you are, whether you like it or not. The real strength is being willing to keep looking even when the reflection hurts. James nodded, scribbling frantically. You think I could do it? He asked softly. Be a good officer? Bryce looked at him, the same way Bannister had once looked at him, and smiled. You already took the first step, he said. You asked the right question. That night, back in his apartment, Bryce sat at his table again, same notebook, same pen. But this time the page felt different. Not a confession. Not a reckoning. A promise. He turned to a new page and wrote at the top. The badge is a mirror. Underneath he added. 1. Growth starts where pride ends. 2. Listening is stronger than shouting. 3. Being right is meaningless if you leave others feeling wrong. 4. The job isn't to command respect. It's to deserve it. 5. Legacy is built in silence, one moment at a time. Then he closed the book, not because the journey was over but because the next chapter had to be lived, not written. Outside, the city moved on, sirens, streetlights, lives unfolding. And somewhere in that pulsing heart of Toledo, a rookie no longer stood at a crossroads but on a path. Flawed. Real. Unfinished. But walking forward, one decision at a time. What started as arrogance became a lesson in humility, responsibility, and rebirth. Officer Bryce Callahan's journey is a reminder that wearing a badge doesn't make you worthy of respect. It's the choices you make that do. As Judge Bannister said, you are not the badge. You are the decisions you make while wearing it. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of your own moment of reckoning, let us know in the comments below. Share your story. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, raw, real, and echoing with truth, subscribe to True Echo, where we don't just tell stories. We carry them forward. Hit that subscribe button, share this video, and let the echo reach someone who needs it today.